I would like to spend a few minutes talking about the United States and our impressions and attitudes toward NATO after the end of the Cold War. And for most Americans, we were thrilled. We were happy. We thought that NATO was great. It was a victory for the United States, victory for NATO, the United States being a major part of NATO. And we saw it as a culmination, but also a beginning. And very shortly after the end of the Cold War, NATO began to try to reconsider what their role was, and very quickly talked about expansion into Eastern European countries. And in 1994, a partnership for peace policy was begun through NATO to essentially introduce Eastern European countries, the former Soviet bloc countries, into what might become membership in NATO in future years. And we've seen that happening. And for Americans, that's good. We think of that as positive. We think of that as very, very useful. And in 1998, or around that time, the government of Russia was given a separate status, per se, in which they participate in some war games, they participate in debates, but without veto power. So they are not full members of NATO, but they do participate with NATO in some ways. And most Americans see that as positive. Some Americans who are still very much Cold War oriented see that the role of NATO is to block any growth and any power development of Russia that could become problematic in the future. And for the most part, when Americans think of NATO, they respect very much what NATO is doing and the role of NATO. Many hundreds of thousands of American troops have served with NATO troops in Europe and in other countries, and have a long tradition of doing so. In my case, I met my husband while he was serving in the United States Army at a NATO base in Germany. And so NATO has always been kind of familiar to my family and myself. And we look at NATO as that entity which uses force when necessary, and that is to protect its members from outside threat. And September 11th, 2001 was really the benchmark for Americans. It refocused America immediately on the importance of NATO. And it looked at Article 5, because NATO invoked Article 5 immediately. And Article 5 essentially says an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all members of NATO. And that if one is attacked, then the others should take what actions that they feel are appropriate for each country, and in order to defend the victim of the attack. And that's exactly what we saw after 9/11. All of the NATO countries immediately participated and immediately took action, and are still taking action. Just last night on television, I saw the ceremony in Italy of the Italian troops that were killed in Afghanistan last week. And we have constant reminders of NATO connection. And most Americans, as with so many other things, don't pay a lot of attention to NATO or other organizations unless they see that there is an immediate reason to do so. 1997 survey showed that 61% of the American people supported keeping NATO, but only 21% admitted knowing some or anything about NATO. So they may support it, but they may not know that much about it. That being said, Americans are paying attention to Afghanistan. They are paying attention to the piracy off the Somali coast, and NATO is the major player in both cases. And so I think that Americans are paying more attention. They just don't realize that they're paying attention to something that does involve NATO. And when we look at that transition that NATO has made from the Cold War to what today is the War on Terror, I think that one thing that should be noted is that the Cold War and the War on Terror are very different types of wars. There are some intellectuals who are saying that the Cold War was World War III and the War on Terror is World War IV. Most don't say that. That's a minority. Most people realize that both the Cold War and the War on Terror are not wars in the traditional sense of war, but they are ideologies. Communism for the Cold War and extremist Islamic terrorists for the War on Terror. And very, very different things, because with both the Cold War and the War on Terror, what you have is really a decrease in the need for military personnel and money going directly toward arms and weapons, but an increase in the need for propaganda, policing, some say nation building, spying, and other means of trying to deal with threats that are changing radically and rapidly and will be with us for a very long time. Just as the Cold War was with us for a very long time, we see no end in sight. And NATO has been changing itself to fit the new War on Terror that we will be faced with for a very long time. Right after the end of the Cold War, the United States breathed a big sigh of relief and said, phew, we can go home now. We don't have to do anything. And we will go home. And they saw it as a peace dividend. We're at peace, now we can go home and take care of things at home. We can concentrate on domestic issues, we can cut our military, and that's exactly what we began to do. And we began to look at the world not from an isolationist perspective as we may have seen prior to World War II, but instead from a perspective that says, let's better our country, let's better our people, better our education systems, and so forth. And that's kind of where we were coming from. We concentrated throughout the 1990s on economic growth, on more people being able to own a home, more people being able to have things. And that all ended. 9/11, again, 2001, changed the American people forever. And we were given a wake-up call we never thought we'd have to face. The last time any part of the United States had been attacked to that point was the beginning of American involvement in World War II, which was Pearl Harbor. And there was more loss of life on 9/11 than there was at Pearl Harbor. It was done in a civilian context. People from dozens of countries were killed, not just Americans, as the World Trade Center towers collapsed and the Pentagon was attacked, and the American people immediately changed their footing and immediately looked outside again and looked directly to NATO and worked and have been continuing to work directly with NATO ever since. So the American involvement and the transition of NATO for America to the war on terrorism has changed the way a lot of us think. Just think of going to an airport and trying to walk through an airport without your bag of plastic bag of gels and creams and things like that, taking off your shoes and going through metal detectors. It's a whole new world, and we see it in Charleston, where I live, because we're a port city, where our ports are being monitored now because of the terrorist threat. And it's also a military port in which we see Army and Air Force materiel being moved in and out of Charleston all the time. So it's a very much an alive and active presence in the United States. And now I'd like